So what is communal computing, right? Communal devices are things that are in your home or office, and that could include things like the Amazon Echo, which was, I think, really the first one that was very connected. There's always been kind of connected services, but this is the more general purpose device that started getting into your home. There's things like the Google Home Hub, the Facebook portal, things like that, which are devices with screens, video cameras, being able to do more functionality even than just like audio only devices like the Echo. But I'd include aspects like smart light bulbs, this idea of smart sockets, even the Apple TV, to a certain extent, when you talk about communal or shared devices that multiple people will use either over the course of a day or at the same time, TVs are definitely one of those. And then I think you could even go further back and start talking about this idea of the landline phone that was in everybody's kitchen, probably when everybody was growing up here. But again, I always also feel like maybe I'm starting to become like an anachronism. But the idea of like, you would call this phone number and some random person in this household would pick up the phone and then help route you to the right person, right? That was like the first communal device that was connected to other people. But there's always been things that have, like, everybody's used, like bookcases are a great example of where people that live in the space all utilize the bookcase in some way. So I think this is something that is part of a human pattern of usage, but has become weirder and weirder as we've started to connect devices to the rest of the internet and to other people. There's a bunch of problems though. And so I want to start with an example around Sonos, around Spotify. And so what you can see here is this is an example of the recommendation set. This is probably like a couple months ago for me. And so you can see that there's a bunch of different types of music that I'm listening to. But what's interesting is that one of these playlists is actually not a playlist for me. And so this one down here, my kids listen to a lot of kind of kids music, musicals. Frozen music has been like really popular in our household. And so this particular mix is not one, I mean, I have listened to Les Mis, by the way. I have listened to Les Mis before, so I will claim that. But the fact that it became a daily mix for me is because my kids are listening to their music on the Google Home Hub in my kitchen. And so the fact is that the behavioral data that they're collecting from all these different places are now being merged into my account, right? And it's creating a weirdness in my recommendation set. And the reason why this ends up happening is basically because I think they're built wrong, right? And what I would say about why they're built wrong in general is because they are about this single user context. And so, what problems arise when we talk about communal computing? And the first one that we've just talked about was identity, which is who's actually in front of the device, who's using it, what should we help with them with? The second thing is around privacy. How is it that information that I have is being now turned into something inside of a larger network? And am I meaning for it to be that way or not? The third thing is security. And so there's a lot of cases where, inside to get into a communal space, you usually have to pass through something like a locked front door, or in the office, like you have to key card into something. So there are some interesting kind of security implications already there. But the problem is that now when I'm actually in this somewhat more trusted zone of, say, my home, how much should my partner or my kids have to actually authenticate to prove that they are me or whatever, or that they are themselves, and not show that they are me? And so I think there's some interesting security applications here. The fourth one is experience. So what should come up for me is probably very different than what should come up for my kids. And not only because of, say, consent and privacy issues, but also because I'm just a different person, right? If it's me, and then added to that, identity is not just about the idea of me as a singular person, but it could be me plus the entire family looking at something. And that is a very different context than just me individually. And so the experience should be able to adapt to that. And then finally, ownership, right? Once we start putting these devices into a shared space, there's a lot of problems that start to crop up when companies decide to change their terms of use or start charging a subscription. And so what happens to that data? So it's related to privacy and experience, but what happens to the data once things need to change? And so let me go take you through like some quick examples of each one of these. So identity, I like to use this graph. This was part of the article that I wrote with O'Reilly about kind of a description of the problems around identity, but there's a whole spectrum of people that end up going into people's homes or offices that range in the amount that I trust them versus don't, right? And so on the far right side, it's like me and my partner, and then it starts to go down to children, in-laws living with me, guests, say dinner party guests, service workers, cleaners, handymen, any of those types of people, to a landlord, and then finally the person that I probably trust the least is someone that's broken in. And so we need to consider all of these different identities and also the combination of these identities. So I have a bunch of different pseudo identities that are part of me. And so there's my family identity, there's my work identity, there's my school friends identity, there's the golfing identity, there's all these different identities that I have that make up me. And so these are things that we need to consider more when we talk about communal computing, because mismatching my identity, if you show my pictures that are memories from Facebook of when I was drunk at college at a dinner party with a bunch of guests that are family friends, probably not appropriate, right? So identity is really, really important in this case. Privacy keeps on coming up, and I've used contextual integrity as a framework, and I can definitely provide links to this, but it's a really great framework that talks about this idea that people don't want to just hide their information and make it either private or not. What they actually want is they want to be able to control the flow of it. And so in this particular case, right, people that were using Flickr and then putting photos in a Creative Commons space did not really expect IBM to come along later and grab all those photos to then do facial recognition training. And so while it was data that they were putting out in public, it wasn't the endpoint that it went to was not the one that those people were expecting. And so there was a lot of concern about this. There was actually, I think, an FTC investigation into it. When it comes to security, the issue of people moving in and out of the household can cause lots of problems. So this is a really, really interesting article in the New York Times about how these different types of smart home devices can be used to basically harass and abuse people by the abusers that have left the home. And so they are the ones that potentially still have access to the Wi-Fi, the internet, the devices. And in this case, they've been changing locks, they've been turning up the thermostat, they've been doing things that are very harassing. But it actually takes a lot of work to disengage people from the communal space of the home in some way. Animistic design, this actually comes from a bunch of old religious contexts, like when we talk about spiritualism for maybe 100,000 years of humanity. It's this idea that both animals and even inanimate objects like rocks, this is an example of one of the most famous Zen shrines in Japan, have some type of spirit that is part of them. And basically there's a lot of other kind of totems and symbolism that comes with animism as a religious or spiritual study. But I think what's really interesting is when you start to think about it from the standpoint that we've wanted to personify things for a very long time. That's why we see faces in everything that we look at, is because we're always trying to find other people to connect with. And the same thing for us to be able to understand how natural phenomena works, we end up thinking about it as a way of how would this actually be a human being? And so even things like Greek gods or animal spirits in Native American spirituality assigns these personalities to things in a way that you can understand them. So the idea of a fox as a trickster is a really interesting one because they're stealing food or they're sneaking around or something like that, right? And so it helps you understand the behavior in a way that is also now mapped to a human understanding in the way that we're really good at understanding other humans. And so I wanted to reference the last talk that was done here at AI and Design. And I thought it was really great that she referenced this idea of animism, the idea of ecosystems approaches. And so I just want to make sure it was very clear, I think it's awesome that she brought this up. I think it's really, really interesting and amazing to talk about when it comes to the AI kind of context. And so, where I first came across this idea of animism was through this work by Jason Wong, who was an Art Center College of Design student. And he created something called the Committee of Infrastructure, which there's a bunch of videos, and I'll provide you a link to this later. But it talked about this idea of a municipal hearing around some type of freeway change or intersection change, but from models that maybe would not necessarily get the say that they would usually. So in this case, it's not only the idea of the council members, but it's the idea of the Department of Transportation. And they have a bunch of information about intersections that they're collecting all the time that can create models, predictive models. But we're also now including this idea of street smarts and the people for the ethical treatment of animals in a way that animals are impacted by these intersections in some way. And so all of these different groups, there are different kind of models that are making arguments for different cases based on what they're trying to represent. And so I think this was the first step into animism. And where that really I think led me to was this work by Philip Van Allen, who is a professor at Art Center right now, but is going to be moving on to, I think he's doing something else after this, around animistic design. And he wrote this paper in digital creativity that was really, really interesting to me. And so the quote here is really, rather than having people work with a single authoritative system, right? Like this all-encompassing system that is the big blue glowing brain that symbolizes AI that we're going to interact with, and everybody's going to have their own conversation with this big brain. We'd rather engage with these like smart systems where each entity has its own intentions, expertise, moods, goals, data sources, and methods, right? So each individual thing actually has some type of kind of way for us to interact with it. And the actual activity that they ended up using for this was for a person doing creative work, having multiple devices on their kind of desk, helping them do creative work. And so the idea of like the nostalgic would bring up photos from 10 years ago, the nerd would bring up facts. All these things had different personalities that you could start to understand, but would help you in some way as you were building something. Thank you everybody for participating. Let's go ahead and for the next step, what I'd love for everybody to do is I'd love for you to take a moment to introduce your device. And so say your name. If you want to pull everybody to you as well, I think you should be able to do that. And then I would love for you to talk about the traits, maybe just like a little bit of explanation about why you chose those traits. And then I want you to take us through each one of the emotions and talk about those, okay? So why don't we start, since whoever chose upper left-hand corner usually wants to go first. That's what I've decided. Why don't we do that first?
Sure. Let's start with that. Hi, my name is Otto. Otto, because it's round and it's the same from every direction, so you can it can go around and it's still the same. And I can be devoted, impatient, and overly enthusiastic. Because it really wants to clean all the time. And yeah, impatient, it runs and runs, no matter if there's something in the way, and over enthusiastic because it keeps running and doing stupid things also. So so a little bit of both here. And yeah, when I'm happy, I light up and just do my job as it should be. When I'm sad, I'm most likely out of energy. I worked a lot and then I feel a little bit sad that I can't work anymore. So I go charging. I go to my home station. When I'm disgusted, I make a loud sound to make it clear that I'm disgusted. And yeah, maybe I should clean myself or anyone else should. And if I'm afraid, I just run in a different direction. I just run away. And that's it. And when I'm surprised, I just keep running. And maybe the solution for that is to just turn a little bit to the side. And when I'm angry, I just stop working. And yes, somebody should help.
So what I'd love to ask now is I want to let's explore a little bit about the way these different devices would work with each other. And so we'll just use a couple examples here. So what I'd love to hear is, how do both Lux and Gucci, how would you interact with each other?
I guess I would probably turn myself off and on according to Gucci. So probably when Gucci is on, I needn't operate. But that again depends.
Yeah, that's great.
I think there's two options here. One is that we coordinate the same light so that it doesn't clash. Or two, like when one is on and the other is off, or vice versa, depending on the mood.
So I would love to hear how Otto, if we brought Otto into the mix now, how would Otto work with Gucci and Lux?
Well, for one, I would say maybe if the light is on, I shouldn't or should be operating depending on the owner. So so maybe he likes if he control it, if the owner wants to control it, he should be there physically. So if the light is on, most likely is. But on the other hand, it's loud. So if somebody is around, it shouldn't be on probably.